Dust hung in the air like a veil that evening, soft and copper-colored beneath the sinking sun, and the town of Dry Creek gathered with a hunger that had nothing to do with supper. The saloon's music had gone quiet, men spilling into the square, boots crunching against the dry earth. Children perched on fences, their eyes wide with cruel fascination, while women stood in their Sunday shawls, lips pursed as if the very sight of what was about to happen would soil them. At the center of it all stood a wooden platform hastily built, a stage of shame where no song would ever be sung. Upon that platform were two sisters, their bare feet pressed into splintered planks, shoulders wrapped in dresses torn and threadbare, hair tangled with dust. Naya, the elder, stood straight despite the eyes upon her, her hand clasping that of her younger sister with fierce determination. Her dark eyes carried a storm, though her body bore scars that time and cruelty had etched deep. Beside her, Taya trembled, only 18 summers behind her, lips pale, as though each breath cost her courage. To the gathered townsfolk, they were not daughters, not women, not even human in the full sense. They were a spectacle reduced to silence and skin, and the crowd gathered with a greed that made the evening air thick. The sheriff presided over the affair, his voice rising like the caw of a crow. Two strong girls, he declared, standing tall with his thumbs hooked in his belt, the law pinned like a badge of righteousness against his chest. Hard workers, fine hand for chores, both for one price. Make your bid. His words were met with laughter, low whistles, and muttered wagers. Some men joked about how they'd put the girls to use. Some women shook their heads, claiming it was no surprise that savages would meet such an end. Naya's jaw tightened at the word, but she kept her eyes fixed forward, holding her sister's hand so tightly Taya winced, though she did not let go. In the back of the square, a man stood apart. His hat brim shaded his face, and his coat carried the dust of long days on the trail. Ethan McGraw had not come to town seeking this sight, but once his eyes found the sisters, he could not turn away. For years he had lived with the silence of his ranch, where the only voices belonged to cattle lowing against the wind. His wife had been taken by fever 5 winters past, and the child she carried with her. Since then, the walls of his home had echoed with absence, the fields stretching empty, though he worked them from dawn until dark. He had learned to bury loneliness in labor, but that evening something old and raw stirred in him, something that remembered shame. He knew what it was to be measured and found lacking. As a boy, when his father had died and left him nothing but a patched coat and calloused hands, he had been mocked for the poverty that shadowed him. He remembered standing in church, feeling every eye on him as though he did not belong among them. That memory now whispered as he watched the sisters stand under the gaze of a crowd that stripped them of dignity. The auction began without ceremony. Men barked low sums, jeering as though buying livestock at a fair. "Ain't worth the feed they'd eat," one voice shouted. Another offered a single silver dollar just to hear the laughter that followed. The sheriff chuckled, playing to the crowd, as if cruelty itself were good sport. Naya's shoulders stiffened, her pride straining against humiliation. Taya leaned into her, wishing herself invisible, yet every eye bore into her fragile frame. And then Ethan moved. He stepped forward, boots steady on the dirt, the crowd parting not out of respect but confusion. His hand went to his pocket. The coins he carried no more than what any honest rancher might keep. His voice, when it came, was quiet, so quiet that the laughter dulled to catch it. "I'll take them home," he said, his words falling not as a boast, but as a simple truth. The square stilled. Mrs. Callahan, who ran the boarding house, let out a gasp sharp enough to pierce the silence. "What kind of man," she hissed to her neighbor, "brings wild blood to his table?" Whispers grew like a sudden wind. Some called him foolish, others worse. The sheriff's brows knit together, displeased at having the game spoiled, but a sale was a sale. He spat into the dust, named the price low, and Ethan laid the coins down without bargaining. When Naya heard the words, she did not at first believe them. Bought like cattle, yes, but the man's eyes, when they met hers, held no ridicule. There was no leering hunger, no mocking cruelty, only a steadiness that unsettled her more than cruelty might have. She lowered her gaze, unsure of what such eyes could mean. Taya clutched her hand tighter, whispering with trembling breath, "What will he do to us?" Naya had no answer. Ethan approached the platform, but unlike the others, he did not reach to seize them, did not bind their wrists or force them down. He simply nodded toward the wagon hitched nearby, its wooden bed carrying tools and feed. "Ride with me," he said, voice even as though inviting them to a place of rest rather than possession. The sisters hesitated, but the sheriff gave them a shove, eager to be rid of the matter, and they stumbled forward. Taya climbed onto the wagon with the grace of a startled fawn, her eyes darting in every direction. Naya followed, slow and wary, settling beside her sister with her back stiff as a drawn bow. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, gathering the reins with quiet patience. The crowd's whispers followed them like a trail of dust, judgment clinging in the air. As the wagon rolled out of town, the lanterns of Dry Creek flickered behind them, their light shrinking against the rising night. Taya dared one glance at the man who now held their fate, studying the rugged lines of his face, the silence in his posture. She braced for command, for cruelty, for the weight of chains, but none came. Instead, he guided the horses with calm hands, saying nothing, as if silence itself could grant them a fragile dignity. Naya sat with her chin lifted, though her heart thundered beneath her ribs. She hated the weight of being bought, hated the eyes that had measured her worth and found it cheap. Yet some small ember, deep and hidden, refused to die. For the first time since being dragged onto that platform, she allowed herself the dangerous thought that this journey might lead somewhere other than despair. The road stretched long beneath the pale moonlight, dust curling from the wagon wheels, and the night grew quiet but for the creak of wood and the steady rhythm of hooves. Ethan kept his gaze forward, yet something within him stirred at the presence of the two women behind him, something that whispered of change. He did not speak, for words felt too heavy in such a moment, in the stillness of that ride. 3 lives had shifted course, bound not by choice but by fate, and though the town behind them would gossip and scorn, the night carried them toward a place unknown, where silence might yet become sanctuary. The sisters clung to each other, Ethan to the reins, and all 3 to a fragile thread of possibility, stretched taut, but unbroken as the prairie winds whispered over the land. The wagon creaked to a halt at first light, the horizon washed in pale gold, and Ethan McGraw's ranch came into view. Weather-beaten fences leaned like old men against the earth, the barn's timbers gray with years of wind, and the house itself, plain sturdy, built by his own hands, sat quiet as if waiting for breath. For Ethan, the place was a monument to endurance, to solitude carried like a yoke across his shoulders. For Naya and Taya, it was a mystery, neither cage nor refuge yet, but a threshold they could not name. When they climbed down, the younger sister lingered close to the wagon, her eyes wary of the empty fields that stretched in every direction. Naya stood tall beside her, the desert strength in her bones refusing to bow even now. Ethan lifted a bundle from the wagon bed, set it upon the porch, and pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar. For the marks of years of use, every groove telling its own tale. He gestured without flourish. "This is home," he said, his voice calm as river stone. Taya glanced to Naya, searching for guidance, but her sister gave nothing away. They stepped inside together, feet silent upon the planks, and for a moment it seemed the silence might smother them all. Ethan set bread and a pot of beans on the table. He did not beckon, did not insist. He merely placed the food and sat across from them, waiting as though patience itself was language enough. The sisters exchanged uncertain looks. Hunger gnawed sharp, but pride warred within Naya's chest. At last, Taya reached out, trembling fingers breaking the bread. Only then did Naya allow herself to eat. Ethan said nothing, but in the quiet, trust took root like a seed under ash. Days passed beneath the open sky, each one measured not in hours but in the work of hands. Taya learned to fetch water from the well, carrying the bucket with both arms, spilling little by little until strength grew in her. Naya mended a fence with Ethan, her fingers nimble as she tied wire to wood. She expected orders, expected his voice to cut like a whip, yet he gave only gestures, suggestions spoken low, as though they worked together, not apart. Each night the three sat in muted company, the crackle of the hearth filling the silence. The ranch, which had long echoed with loneliness, began to hold the weight of presence, fragile but undeniable. Yet the world beyond the ranch did not forget. Gossip traveled faster than any horse. In the mercantile, Mrs. Callahan told anyone who would listen that Ethan McGraw had lost his senses. Brought 2 Apache girls under his roof, she said, her lips sharp as scissors. What do you call that, if not sin? Men muttered in the saloon, their talk sour with whiskey, claiming it was an insult to decency. Even Sheriff Boone, who had taken his coins gladly, now came riding with a smirk, warning Ethan that folks were uneasy. Best send them back, McGraw. You'll find yourself on the wrong side of this town. Ethan met his gaze without flinching. They're staying, he said simply, and Boone left with a laugh that promised trouble. One night, the sky split open with storm. Rain lashed the land, wind screaming through the gaps in the barn walls. A section of the corral collapsed, and the cattle scattered in panic. Ethan rushed out, boots sinking in mud, shoulders straining against the storm as he wrestled to mend the break. Then Naya was beside him, sleeves soaked, hair plastered to her face, hands raw against splintered wood. She did not wait for command, did not shrink from labor. Together, they lifted, tied, braced, until the fence stood once more against the storm. When at last the rain softened, Ethan looked at her through dripping lashes. She met his gaze, steady, breathless, equal in her exhaustion. For the first time, no wall of shame stood between them. Taya watched from the porch, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. She saw something unspoken pass between them, not desire, not yet but recognition. 2 souls scarred, carrying weight too heavy to bear alone, had found themselves working side by side. In that storm, dignity began to bloom where humiliation once rooted. But Dry Creek's disdain gathered like thunderclouds. Days after the storm, Boone returned, not alone this time. He brought men with rifles slung across their saddles, faces hard with judgment. They halted at the gate, and Boone called out, his voice slick with authority. "We've had enough of this, McGraw. Those girls don't belong here. Hand them over, and let's end this peaceably." Ethan stood in the yard, rifle in hand, though he did not raise it. His stance was calm, but steel threaded his words. "They belong under no man's boot. Not yours, not mine. They're here, and here they'll stay." The men shifted, uneasy at his defiance. Boone sneered, urging them forward, but none wished to be first against a man whose resolve stood like iron. Silence stretched, broken only by the restless snort of horses. Boone spat into the dirt, muttered threats, and turned his mount. The men followed, shame hidden behind gruff laughter, retreating into the distance. The sisters had watched from the doorway, their hearts hammering with fear. When the dust of the riders faded, they stepped forward. Ethan lowered his rifle, setting it aside as if to say violence was never the aim. Naya searched his face, words caught in her throat. What she saw there was not possession but protection, not pity but recognition. For the first time since her childhood, she allowed herself to exhale without fear. Taya, trembling still, laid her head lightly against Ethan's arm, a gesture of gratitude she could not voice. He did not move, only let the silence carry their meaning. That evening, the three sat by the fire. The storm had passed, the night air fresh with earth washed clean. Taya hummed softly, a tune from long ago, her voice fragile but steady. Ethan listened, the sound weaving through the rafters, filling the hollows of his house like light. Naya sat with her hands folded, her gaze lowered, yet her heart stirred with a strange warmth. She had expected chains, had braced for cruelty, but instead found herself seated in a place where dignity was not stolen but returned. The fire cracked, sparks rising like stars, and Ethan let the quiet linger. He thought of the crowd's eyes in Dry Creek, of the scorn that would not cease, but also of the faces beside him. Two sisters, scarred yet unbroken, whose presence had turned his silence into something living. He did not speak of future or fate, but in his chest a vow took root, as steady as the earth beneath his boots. And as the flame softened, the narrator's voice rose, not to them but to all who might listen. Sometimes the world will weigh a soul as though it were cattle, cheap and undeserving. But love, whether found in labor shared, in silence respected, or in a single act of defiance, has a way of unshackling the spirit. So, if loneliness is your burden, remember, one day, perhaps when least expected, you too may be chosen, not for what you cost, but for who you are,